Yeah, sure. I'm Danielle. I'm going to actually introduce everything in our panel in a second. I'm actually calling in right now from Austin, Texas.
I'm calling in from Montreal, where it is still winter for like another month and a half. So Austin sounds lovely.
Hi, I'm Irene, and I'm from the Bay Area.
Hi, I'm Donna, and I'm calling in from Brooklyn, New York.
My name's Hannah. I forgot to introduce myself.
That's okay. It looks like we're joining quickly, so we'll get started and people can join as they come. Welcome. We're so excited to have you all here. This is our first online event, and so it's a bit of an experiment. So we're really excited that y'all are joining us for this and for our Women Talk Conference's remote event. As I shared, my name's Danielle, and I'm the CEO of Women Talk Design. Our mission is to see more diverse speakers on stage, and so we're really excited to have some amazing women who are here today, who all have various speaking experience to share a little bit about their own speaking experience and how they got started and their advice that they have for getting started. And we hope that in listening to this, you can learn a lot, hear about their experiences, and also be inspired to start speaking yourself. And so kind of the format of this is going to be, I have some questions that will get us started. We'll get to know our panelists a little bit first. We'll also then dive into some questions. There's a Q&A feature on Zoom. So you can go to the Q&A feature at the bottom. You can type in your question. You can also upvote other people's questions. And we're going to save time in the last 20 minutes or so to go those questions in Q&A. If you can't get it to work, feel free to add it in the chat, but I'm going to try out the Q&A feature. So hopefully it works. For those of you who just joined, kind of the format of this is we aren't able to see you on video. We have our panelists here, but you can chat in. We'd love to hear where you're calling in from, and that'd be great. And let's get started, because I know we're, time is of the essence. And so, as I said, I want to get started just introducing this fabulous group of people that we have here. So we have Donna Lichaw, who is a leadership coach, a speaker, and an author calling in from New York. And she helps leaders in tech and adjacent fields unlock their superpowers so that they can get unstuck, level up, and lead more effectively and make an impact in their work and life. And she works with changemakers at storied tech companies like Google and Apple, and innovators and impactful startups and nonprofits, including YWC and Central Park Conservancy, and emerging leaders, especially women and members of the LGBTQ community who want to make a difference at work. We also have Hannah Nagel, who has experience ranging from nonprofits to startups to enterprise, is connected by a commitment to using a research-driven approach to help solve people's problems. She's currently in a role as a service designer with Element AI, where she's working with clients and the product team to help solve the right problems with AI. And she was born in California, raised in Vancouver, calling in now from Montreal, firmly believes that the West Coast is the best coast. And she is joining us here today. And then finally, we have Irene Au, who's a design partner at Khosla Ventures, where she works with early, mid, and late stage startup CEOs. She has unprecedented experience elevating the strategic importance of design within companies, and has built and led entire UX and design companies at Google, Yahoo, and Udacity. She began her career as an interaction designer at Netscape Communications, where she worked on the internet's first commercial web browser. And she also teaches yoga in Palo Alto, and she's also a frequent author and speaker on mindfulness practices, design, and creativity. So as I said, a really amazing group here. I'm really excited to hear from them all. And so I just want to start with our first question. We can start with you, Hannah, on why do you speak, right? Speaking can be scary to a lot of people. It could be a lot of work. And so I'd love to hear from each of you. And as I said, we'll start with Hannah on why speak, why do it?
Yeah, the reason I wanted to jump into speaking is, like you mentioned, because one thing, it seemed like a challenge, and it's a challenge I wanted to give to myself. I do naturally kind of enjoy storytelling. I used to work as an editor for a picture book app, and I'm just interested in how we communicate things to people, whether visually or through product or through literally narration storytelling. And I wanted to gain that skill and also gain confidence, because it is even now like a little scary when I get in front of people, and I wanted to keep showing myself that I could do this thing.
Awesome. What about you, Irene?
I think earlier in my career, public speaking was a way of to share what I was working on, which I felt was important and should be shared with people. And at this point now, because I'm a venture capitalist, it's all about relationships and who you know and building your network so that you can help each other. And so for me, my main motivation is just to connect with other people. Some of the most amazing, interesting people I've ever come to know outside of people I directly work with are people that I've met at conferences. And so that's really my primary motivation.
Awesome. Great. What about you, Donna?
So I never wanted to speak. I mean, I guess I'll say I'm a reluctant speaker. For years, my partner was sick of hearing me whine about things, and she'd always say, like, why don't you channel that and do some public speaking or something, you know, speak at conferences, and I refused to do it. But I started speaking, and I speak now because I started speaking because I was asked to. First by colleagues asking me to teach classes, which that was the first time I realized, I have something to say. And then over time, people asked me to join panels and eventually give workshops and then talks as well. Now it's turned into, I often ask to speak. And I think it's more like Irene said, where now I feel like I have something to say and I have something to share and I can help people. But it definitely, it took a long time to get there.
Yeah. Awesome. All slightly different reasons for speaking. And I think that's great because there are so many reasons why someone might get started and they might change throughout your career, like you said, Donna. I'd love, Donna, you started talking about a little bit about how you first started speaking. And I'd love if each of you could share what that first speaking experience is like. So how you got it? Did you reach out to someone? Did they reach out to you? And what was it like? How did it feel? Donna, you can start.
Sure. So, my first, so lightly, it was teaching was really, how I got into speaking, and it was sort of required to create a little mini lecture for each class, and that was just a colleague asking if I would help her out. But I think my first stage thing was a panel, and it was a panel that a colleague of mine asked me to participate on about product management. And at the time, I had moved over from design into product management. And he's someone who I'd called on for, as a mentor for advice and thoughts over the years. And so he knew that I could get on stage. I didn't want to, but he, asked nicely for me to be on the panel. And once I got so many people contacted me after that panel, thanking me for helping them and helping them decide to become product managers and making the shift themselves, that I realized that not only was it fun to be on the panel, but I could help people. And so that snowballed. But I was asked. I had to be
Awesome.
asked.
Yeah. What about you, Irene?
I think the first time I spoke at a conference was probably an academic conference. It was like Human Factors and Ergonomic Society conference. So this was when I was in graduate school in 1995 or 1996 or whatever. And so my first few speaking engagements were like that, either at HFES or UPA or CHI. And they were paper submissions. And I was presenting in that context. And I think eventually over time, maybe in the late 90s, I started getting invited to speak on panels at similar conferences. And over time, that has really evolved. Now I only speak when I'm invited. Similar to Donna, I think we've flipped. Like, I'm a reluctant speaker now, and I'm very judicious about where I speak, and it's only under certain conditions will I agree to it. But it's always by invitation at this point, whereas earlier in my career, it was like paper submissions and academic conferences.
Awesome. And Hannah?
So the first time that I spoke was actually last year at the Lesbian SUTEC Summit in San Francisco. And I applied to speak about trying to just put my favorite topics together, which were picture books and designing for system complexity. And since then, I've applied to speak at a couple of places and have now been invited to speak at some other places, and also been invited to be on panels such as this one, but also speaking around diversity in tech or kind of service design topics.
Awesome. That's great. And I love that you started talking about the topics that you started to talk about, because I know that that's something that holds a lot of people up in speaking. They wonder, well, what should I be talking about? What topics aren't being talked about already? What am I qualified to speak about? And so I'd love if each of you can share a little bit about your process for coming up with your talk topic, and maybe how that's changed over time as well. Irene, do you want?
I was just reflecting on that. So I think, that earlier in my career, it would be about maybe a specific project that I had worked on and it had launched. And then there was like something I could talk publicly about, like the process for getting there, or the process of building our team, or, how to set up a user-centered design practice. Because at that time, there weren't many people doing that kind of thing. These days, I usually get invited to speak, and then the organizers say, just talk about whatever you'd like to talk about, or they might have a specific topic in mind. So like there were these TEDx organizers who had a very specific topic. And so that actually was helpful because it could give me something to wrap my head around and then flesh out my ideas around it. The ones that are more open-ended are much tougher, because then it's like anything goes. And I'm usually tapping into what am I thinking about right now and what's moving and inspiring me. And the process for it looks like a lot of walking around. For me, it's just like stepping away from the computer and just getting out there and experiencing the world, and then reflecting on whatever it is that whatever inspiration comes to mind, or I usually try to generate a lot of different ideas and then narrow it down. So similar to, design process. But it is super hard, and it is a bit like squeezing water out of a stone for me, because I try really hard to prepare something that's really personally meaningful and relevant to me, but also something that people can take away from, that's interesting for them, that they can reflect on in their own lives. Like, oh, this is what I can take away from it and do something with it. So I want it to be provocative. I want it to be a contemplation, and I want it to be different than anything people could hear from anyone else.
Awesome. That's great. Thanks for giving us that insight, especially of how it's changed over time. I think that's been really helpful. Mm-hmm. And Hannah, I know you shared a little bit about the topics that you're speaking on now. How did you come to, I know you said you're excited about it and passionate about it, but how did you actually come to choose that?
So last year I went to a really great speaking workshop led by Catherine Presner, and her really great advice to everyone there was to talk about what you kind of naturally, launch into your own rants about, like when someone asks you a question and you just have so much to say about it. And for me, those topics were like picture books and how we design or deliver kind of like complex concepts in really simple and clear ways, and how do we design for complex services or systems that involve a lot of different users and areas and devices, etc. And then diversity, the role that diverse teams play in delivering these kind of new systems and design for the future. And I just started taking some of those things that I was, naturally excited about and reading about and putting them together. And then the next step is making sure that they're clear, because sometimes I'll write it all out and I'll realize I'm pulling from a lot of different areas and concepts, and it might make sense to me, but I kind of have to work through that in a way that will work in kind of a storytelling mode. And then I have about 3 different topics kind of in varying lengths, so maybe from 10 minutes to 50 minutes. And I'll use those to either submit, or when people ask me to talk, I'll pull from one of those topics and see if it matches, their audience and kind of level of expertise, etc.
Yeah, that's great. Having some things in your back pocket that you're ready to pull out at any time. What about you, Donna?
It's a good question. It's a tough question. I think early on it helped to be asked a question. And so if someone would ask me a question in some kind of work context, I'd realize, I have a lot of thoughts on this. And if I had enough thoughts, then what I started doing was turning it into like a conference talk proposal to see if, okay, maybe other people would be interested in this as well. I think then what it's become over time for me is I realize in my career that I see things differently than other people. I see patterns where other people don't see patterns. I see trends. I see ways of being and ways that things can be. And I used to take it for granted that that's the way that everyone saw them. Like, for example, I spent the previous about 5 years of my career helping people building products see the stories of the products that they were building so that they could build more successful products by creating these stories for customers, and but actually building products that deliver on those stories. And this wasn't like a marketing exercise. And for me, that's how I worked for a decade. I was a filmmaker before. I used all the same stuff to build products. And so I thought that's how everyone thought. And once I realized that it wasn't, I started thinking that I should teach that. And so the way I would trick myself into giving talks was first to teach workshops. And then once that resonated with people, if asked nicely, I would turn it into a talk. And then that is like what I did for the previous 5 years. So I guess it's sort of like what do I see that other people don't see? How can I translate it in a way that it teaches them to do something? And then ideally, how can I blow their minds with this thing ultimately? Because if I'm giving a talk, I have to make you think differently. Otherwise, I can't get on stage. So.
Awesome. That's great. And, I know you talked to Hannah and Donnie too, you touched a little bit about this kind of in your process of talking a little bit about storytelling, which I know could be really important in crafting a talk. And so I'd actually love if each of you can share, and maybe we'll start with you, Irene, on how do you craft your talk, right? So now that you have your idea, how do you actually start to craft it from, beginning to end? And even if that process has changed too, I'm very curious, especially for Donna and Irene, who have been speaking for a while now, how has that process changed? And yeah.
This is a great question, because I was just reflecting on this. I think earlier in my career, I was very slides and presentation deck focused. And so I put together the slides first and then talk about the slides. And I've completely inverted that process now, where the slides are the last thing, or in some cases, I just don't show slides at all. So it really is about the story. I usually start with maybe just taking notes to myself in a notebook. At some point, I'll turn that into an outline, and then that outline becomes a narrative. So I will write the whole talk out in a narrative. And that really forces me to be precise about my language. What I have found, not only in myself, but also in observing others, is that when people get up on stage and they just talk about stuff, there's a tendency to either ramble and talk really fast, or there's a tendency to there's like steam that's lost, and then people start to kind of fade out because they don't know where to go next. And I never want to be caught in a situation where I'm in either one. And of course, there are definitely times where I slip into either, but I always want to have a plan. And so that narrative helps me get my head around, what is the plan? Like what is the punchline? What's the arc of the story? Where am I going? And what are the supporting arguments? So I write it all out because that forces me to put some language around each of the concepts. And then I'll turn that into slides. And I'll even mark in my narrative at which point do these points that I'm trying to make correspond with which slides. And I'll also rehearse. And this is another thing that I never did before. I did really early on in grad school. And then at some point I didn't rehearse because I thought, I can wing this, no problem. But then I came to realize the value and importance of just rehearsing the words so that they roll off the tongue and come out of the mouth more easily. And also because I just don't enjoy public speaking at all. So the more I can practice it and do it, the more comfortable I can feel with it. And no matter how many times I get on stage and speak, because I speak at conferences many times a year at this point, and every single time, unless I have a plan, it can be nerve-wracking. So that's all part of it, rehearsing. And then there are also tips and tricks I've learned over time in terms of like getting on stage. Depends on how highly produced the conference is. I've spoken at some conferences where there's a lot of tech, there's a lot of machinery behind the scenes. And so that gives me a little bit more leverage and freedom to say, I want to be able to see all the speaker notes in front of me on one monitor, and I want to be able to see all the slides in front of me on the second monitor. So I'll be very prescriptive about the stage conditions that I'm speaking at. And that's all designed to make sure that I can control the context and that it's predictable for me so that there are no surprises. And you can't really control everything, but to the extent that I can do my part to make sure that that happens, that's helpful. So yeah.
Well, we'll talk about all those things that you control in a little bit. But thanks for sharing that, Irene. What about you, Donna? What's your process like?
Very similar. It's all about the architecture. So I'll start off originally with tons of notes. I use Evernote, so I will like jot things down on my phone when I have an idea, and sometimes like the current talk that I have right now, it took me 2 years to write, and it probably took a year of note taking first, where I was just like, what is my point? I don't know. So I just kept writing things down, and then it goes into story architecture, and that's and I'm meticulous about that. It sounds like, Irene, you are as well, which every point is plotted out, and this partly comes from my filmmaking days, where I learned that if you don't have the story arc zip tight, you're going to lose people, and stories help with learning too. So that and this is all done analog. And actually, let me see if I can. I have a standing desk on wheels, so I'm going to see if I can turn this around so people can see what my office wall looks like. This is an experiment. We'll see if this works. But right there, that's my current keynote. It's been up there for about 6 months. And the talk has changed completely since it originally started. Now it's in slides, and I change it on the fly every time I give it, and I'll be adapting it for years. There we go. But step away from the computer, analog, plot out all my points. There's an invisible arc there. It's how great TV shows and movies and talks are written. And then, yeah, practice, and then iterate, get feedback, see where people are lost, see where it could be better. But yeah, architecture, it's almost a hack. You could give a talk about anything if you have your architecture correct.
Awesome. I loved that visual. Thanks, Donna. That was great. And what about you, Hannah? What's your process like?
So really similar to both Donna and Irene, and I really do approach it from the storytelling perspective and really drawing from picture books as well. So picture books have this really specific, concise structure where they have to be 32 pages long, and there's only about 300 words. And so you can only include images or kind of points that lead you to the conclusion. And so I'll try and work backwards and think about, what do I want people to take away from it? If they only remember one thing, if they're explaining it to somebody else, like what is that takeaway? Which I think is one of the signs of a really great talk. If you ever like overhear someone explaining your talk and they just have that line, you're like, I delivered it and I got it. And then I divide it into 3 sections. So I'm saying this is my main takeaway, and if that, then I have these 3 points that I need to cover or clarify. And really similar to Donna and Irene, it's very like analog for me. So I go back over my notes. Some of them are in Google Notes, or I also use the Notes application, and I just have like tons of notes throughout the year about points that I thought were interesting, and I start to pull those together to kind of formulate the story. And then I kind of start writing out the story, and I see how that flow works, kind of talking through it on my own. And then once I have that narrative and I feel like I've walked people through those 3 kind of main takeaways and we get to the end conclusion, then I'll start doing kind of the slide design. And I'm not a visual designer, so I'll usually pull from something that's kind of like pre-designed, but like very simple. And then I'll send it to my visual designer friends and just get some feedback on alignment and kerning and all of that good stuff. And then I'll practice through it a bit on my own. And then I'll do it in front of my girlfriend a couple times and get her feedback. And then I will do it in public a couple times, just maybe local meetups or in front of my own design team at work, to make sure that I have the right kind of pauses, which are, I think, a good part of storytelling. Also, you need to wait and let people kind of like digest the thought, or maybe you have like a funny point, you want to let the audience kind of like engage with that. And then I feel prepared. I don't like to have my notes, to read my notes when I see the presentation. I find that for me, that throws me off. by the time I deliver the presentation, I want to feel like I've really internalized the story. If there's something that's, you know, too complex for me to remember, and I have to look at the notes, that for me is a sign that I haven't really broken it down enough for me to internalize, and it might be hard for the audience as well. So especially when I'm talking about more complex elements of design, so I just kind of like remove that altogether and see how I can simplify it. I see there's a question in the chat. Should I just jump in there?
Oh, well, yeah. So we're going to save Q&A till the end, but oh, okay. Sorry. I was not in the chat. I was looking in the Q&A. What are the 3 parts? Yeah, since that's building off of the question, you feel free to answer that. Sorry. I was looking also at the Q&A. So yeah, what are the 3 parts for your vision?
3 points, but when I'm delivering my end takeaway, I break it down into 3 supporting sections. So it's like, if point D is the outcome, then I have supporting, not arguments, but supporting theories of A, B, and C that will lead you through. And those might be an introduction to like a particular case study or a concept. But I try to not have either more or less than 3. So you can have these kind of like nuggets that you're holding on to. So I'll introduce the nugget, then I might take a bit more slides to kind of walk through the details of that. But if you were to not get the extra slides, you would be able to just look at literally 3 slides or 3 points and remember the case study or remember the outcome or kind of the new tool that we walked through.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you, Hannah. And I love too that you shared about how you got input and kind of practice in front of different groups of people. I think that's a great thing for people to hear. Awesome. So my next question, and this is actually funny, I was talking about the Q&A, Maggie typed in the Q&A a very similar question. So we'll kind of incorporate that together, but it's around, where do you choose to speak? And so I know that we talked about this a little bit earlier on when we were talking about the speaking opportunities, whether you're applying, whether you're accepting invitations. And I'd love if you can share kind of starting off more broadly, how do you decide what are the opportunities that you want to take on? Be it something that you want to apply for or something that you'll say yes to when you're speaking. And then, Maggie asked even more specifically in the speaker application or request for proposal, are there certain things that you look for if you are applying for a conference? So let's start there. Irene, do you want to share?
Sure, yeah. So I don't really apply to speak at conferences, but I do get invitations. And so there are some boilerplate questions that I always ask just to understand the context of the conference. So who's the audience? What's the audience size? What's the level of the audience? So like, are they entrepreneurs? Are they CEOs? Are they designers? That sort of thing. What is the theme of the conference? Like, what are people trying to get out of the conference? Oh, there was another good question which was, and it's escaping me now, but you get the idea. It's like, I'm trying to understand the audience, and is this the right fit? Is this an audience that I want to connect with? And is there some nice intersection between what I have to offer and what these people are looking for and need? I also want to understand like the dates of the conference, because a lot of times just my schedule is so constrained that I can't make it. So if that's a non-starter, then I'm just going to say no. And then also depending on, how much of a burden it is on me, like my time is worth a certain amount to me. And so if there are conferences that will require me to travel very far, I want to understand, like, will they be willing to pay a speaker's fee because they need to compensate me for my time? Most of them will cover travel costs, but I require business class. I'm just too old now to travel economy to Australia or whatever. So there's certain conditions that I want to see met. And if I don't see those conditions met, then I will just say no. As far as conference size goes, I'm happy to entertain opportunities that range from like 100 people to 20,000 people. And I've done that full range, but it really just depends on all those other conditions that I'm looking for.
Awesome. Thanks, Irene. What about you, Hannah? I know that you mentioned too going through the process of applying recently. So I'd love to hear both, when you're either applying or choosing to speak, what do you look for? And especially in those proposals to answer this question for Maggie, what are some of the specific things that you look for?
Yeah, so when I'm applying to speak somewhere, I always look at the last event that they threw, and I look at who the speakers were and what topics they spoke about. And I also look through their code of conduct, and I look to see if they have any diversity scholarships, and that to me says that they've put some thought into how to kind of walk the walk and really create that community that is valuable to me. And when I'm looking through the kind of the call for proposal, I also like to see that they have crafted something that is clear. There's a lot of kind of small but impactful signals that I look for to see how I think they indicate to me how well they'll care for their speakers. Talks are work, so whether you get an honorarium or your travel costs paid, you're still you need to put a lot of effort into it. And so I want to see signs like throughout that process that they are going to care for their speakers and put thought into the kind of experience that they are delivering, both for attendance and for speakers. And when I am looking to accept opportunities, I also look to see how much time they've given me to prepare. So I have been accepted at places and then declined because they have only given me like 6 weeks out or 8 weeks out. I need a couple months. My calendar is also quite booked, and so whether or not I'm traveling, I usually have maybe only one free weekend in the next 3 months. So that's another sign to me that kind of their planning might leave some room for optimization. And in general, I'm always trying to see what I will get out of this experience as well. Speaking is something that I enjoy, and I love to connect with new people and learn with new people. And whether or not I'm receiving payment or travel costs being covered, I want to get something out of that experience. And I think one thing that people can do, if they don't have the funds to perhaps pay an honorarium or travel costs, is to record your talk. That's one kind of affordable option that most places could think about. And I also want to see that it's conferences for me, or speaking, is kind of an opportunity to connect in real life with some of these online communities. So there's a lot of like user research Slack communities, or like kind of Twitter friends, that I made in the community. And for me, conferences are a way to bring those relationships into 3D. So now I do try and be more kind of selective in the places that I speak at, so that I have an opportunity to both meet old digital friends and then make new friends in that community, and then I can continue to foster those relationships moving forward.
Awesome. Thanks. What about you, Donna? How do you decide where to speak?
So I have two criteria, but I've been shifting it a little bit. But first is, where can I make the biggest impact? And two is how to put this. Is this a worthwhile revenue stream to make up for my not doing other work during this time? And so early on, after being invited to a few panels, I really broke into conferences by teaching workshops. And what I learned early on is that a lot of conferences do 50-50 profit share for workshops, where they'll charge a ticket price and you each take half of the revenue. And my workshops would always sell out, which was great. Like, that's how I started to know I had a topic that people were interested in as well. But so the revenue would be pretty good from a workshop, and I would just go to a conference and do that. But I realized that I would come home with money, but I didn't have the impact that I wanted to, because I was, as one of my colleagues liked to joke, we were in the workshop ghetto, and we'd be off in a corner on day one and no one would ever see us. And so over time, what I started doing was making sure that if I taught a workshop somewhere, I would also either keynote the event, or first speak at the event, and then eventually that became, sure, I would like to keynote your event. And so the other point there is it's always a mix for me of being invited and asking to. I've learned over time that if there's an audience that I really want to connect with, like, I could just ask, see if they'll want me to speak at their conference. And so sometimes I'm invited, sometimes I ask. But yeah, impact and revenue. That said, lately I don't have a new workshop right now because I've moved away from design and product into leadership coaching, and that's all I do now for a living. I don't do any consulting anymore, no product stuff, and so I have a new topic that I'm talking about, which is using the same storytelling and design thinking skills just on yourself as a leader. I have a talk, but not a workshop. So suddenly this past year, my criteria has just been blown to pieces, where now it's just, where can I make the greatest impact? And I have to know that revenue is not going to be what it used to be because I don't have that workshop to teach.
Yeah.
So then it comes closer to Irene, which is, okay, is revenue going to be okay? And somewhere in between Irene and Hannah, which is like, okay, I'm not expecting the rates that I used to command because I'm easing into a new topic. And I'm still too shy to ask for business class tickets for Europe. So I'm more likely to just say, no, thank you. I will not travel to, Europe for this little money. So it becomes like, I have like a whole matrix of equations that I do. But yeah, the biggest thing is impact and revenue, but finding the balance between the two.
Awesome. Yeah. And I appreciate all of you touching on accommodations and compensation, because I know that that's something, particularly for women, can be very difficult to talk about. And it's something that we get asked about a lot is, do conferences pay, or what do they offer speakers? And how do I know this? How do I even bring up this conversation? And so I'd love if any of you have any advice on, if it's not specifically in the call for proposals, or if it's not specifically in the initial outreach email, how do you talk about those things and find out what a conference is willing to offer? How do you have those conversations? Whoever wants.
So academic conferences aren't going to pay. That's just how they work. I have my boilerplate questions, as I mentioned, and one of the questions that I'll ask is there a speaker's fee that you're willing to pay? And so usually they'll say yes, but they're very cagey about how much they're willing to pay. And so we have to get very specific about it. And I find that a lot of UX and design conferences, like the budget might be somewhere between $2,000 and $5,000 if you're keynoting. If you're just giving a talk, maybe they'll pay you, maybe not. And then there are other conferences that are not UX and design focused, that may be more industry focused, that would be more willing to pay. There's some that are huge and don't pay at all. And in fact, they even expect you to pay your own way. So like for me, because I'm a reluctant speaker and I feel like my time is worth a lot, I will just do the thought exercise to ask myself, how badly, how much is this time worth to me? And how much would they need to pay me for it to be worth my time? And so I'll set a price. And, if they say, yes, we'll pay you that amount, that's great. I'll happily go. And if they say no, then it's no big deal to me because I saved my energy and my time. Sometimes I might suggest that, like if they're offering a modest honorarium of less than $5,000, for example, like for me, that's taxable income. And if they're offering economy or premium economy plus an honorarium, I might do something creative, like say, how about instead of the honorarium, you pay for my business class round trip ticket, because that's not taxable. So that's a way for me to just benefit a little bit more and get what's more important to me. Yeah, so it's a range.
Awesome. Yeah. Donna or Hannah, any other thoughts on starting that conversation with organizers?
I have thoughts, but I love your idea, Irene, about swapping money for other things, because I know part of why I started asking for business, or shyly kind of asking for business class sometimes, but maybe not, was certain trips like from New York to the West Coast or Europe or even farther. It's just exhausting, and it takes a couple of days for me to recover, and I was a mess when I would go on site, especially corporate workshops when I was or keynotes or whatever, corporate events. And so it definitely impacts the performance that you give. And so, but I love the idea of switching around how compensation works. I did that once for a conference with my book. Instead of getting paid, because I was thinking of impact. And so instead of getting paid, I asked them to buy the amount of money they would have paid me to instead, so this was $2K, to just buy that many books for the audience and give them out for free, and I'll do book signing. And that ended up being really cool because it just felt good, you know. And again, taxable income, that was, I didn't have to deal with that. I didn't have to deal with another 1099. I didn't have to deal with like all the other stuff. And so, and it's just not a ton of money. Like there are ways to be creative. But for me, the negotiation over the years became like very direct, which is if I was teaching a workshop and giving a talk at a conference, and it was a conference that was doing a revenue share for workshops, I would leave with anywhere from 5 to 14K from 1 to a few days being at a conference. And so anytime I would take something for less than that, I've been offered, like, I learned this the hard way one time when I was speaking at a conference for free. And I was still starting out, and I got invited to keynote a huge conference on the other side of the world for a lot of money. And I had to say no because I was speaking at a conference for free. And I realized I can't do that anymore. And so what it started becoming was really just so on the lower end of the scale would be more community, small events. I could even teach workshops at small community conferences and still leave with 5K. And so it would be like, this is what I need to make. Otherwise I had to say no. This is what I need. And often it would be not like, this is my fee, pay it or I'm walking away. But I always approach negotiation with conferences as a partnership. They are my partners and they are my clients. And I love conference organizers. They all become friends over the years. Like I, hang out with them whenever I see them in a new city, or we, follow each other on Instagram, that kind of a thing. But it would always be like, what budget do you have? This is also good negotiation, I think. What is your, how do you compensate speakers? Oh, you don't know? Okay, what's your budget? And then, okay, well, this is what I typically come home from an event like this. What do you think about that? And then they would be like, oh, we can't do that. And I'd be like, can we offer a workshop maybe? And so it would sort of be a conversation. And sometimes I would have to say no. Even people I really admire, I've known for years, friends even, I've had to say no to, but others have often been able to make something work. So yeah, to kind of answer your question, I would treat it like a good negotiation, which is like, I don't just give a number first. I kind of see where you're coming from, and then I tell you what I'm worth, and then we can see if we can come to something together.
Cool. Awesome. Hannah, anything you want to add about just having conversations about either compensation or also just other accommodations or things that, some of the things that you mentioned that are important for you to have at conferences?
Yeah, I would just add that I'm always a big advocate of just asking for what you need and or want. And I think especially for folks that might be underrepresented in tech or in the industry, that can feel challenging. But don't be afraid to just send an email. You don't have to send this long lengthy thesis explaining why you need all the things. You can just say you need this or you want this, and ask if they can provide that or how close they can come to providing it. And those things may include a certain level of flight class. They might include childcare accommodations. For me, I'm diabetic, so I like to ask what kind of food accommodations they can make for me. And I always want to ask these kinds of things, straight up, because that's a small series of things that I have to think about if I'm going to, fly across the world, and then I get there and I have to do like a whole bunch of grocery shopping for me specifically. That's going to make it more challenging for me. So thinking about a range of things that will make this experience easier for you to do, and more welcoming for you to do, and also thinking about how that might impact the experience you're able to deliver. So they're benefiting from it also in a way. So don't be afraid to ask, and just think about what you need and want. And if you don't have to do a phone call, you can just send a brief written email and go get it.
Awesome. Great. Thank you.
One thing to add to that too, there are other intangibles as well, like if they might be recording your talk with video. Sometimes it's audio only, but sometimes video. So that's something else. Like if there's a perk like that, I'll always do it for less money, because I'd like to have that one video of certain talks. And sometimes it's a trade-off. The other thing I'll add to that as well is, when I was starting out, I just wanted my travel covered. And I did that for a couple of years. And so, you know, I love that there's this, we're covering the spectrum here with the three of us, because a lot of these things do take time. But I know I get a lot of people asking me about money and compensation, and it does take time. It's something that you figure out. It took me years to figure out. And now I'm almost starting all over again because I don't have that workshop. So now I'm like, how much? I'm not getting paid as much as I used to at conferences. And that's fine too. So, you know, it's like, it's a game, it's squishy.
Yeah, and Donna, on that note, actually, we just had a question in the Q&A. They appreciate the honesty, and they want to know about when you were first starting, all of you, when you were first starting out. So were you more flexible on pay or accommodations back then? Did you still do talks if there wasn't a speaker fee? And I know that some of you spoke to this already, but anything you want to add there?
I shared rooms with friends. I was, you know, I'd pay half the flight. I would, you know, there's, of course, starting out, I think there's a lot that you want to be flexible on, but I'll put it back on both of you.
Yeah, I mean, that was my experience also. Like I said, I started out at academic conferences where they're not paying you to speak. It's an honor, you know, to be selected to speak after you submit a paper. So yeah, those expenses were, you know, I would foot the bill, or maybe the company, if I worked at a company. When I was in graduate school, I would have to foot the bill. But when I was working at a company, maybe the company would support me to go, but there was definitely no honorarium. And in general, whenever I was asked to speak as somebody who was an employee of whatever company they wanted to hear represented, like I have spoken in the past about, you know, leading design at Google or whatever, when I was at Google, like I didn't think it was cool to ask for a fee, because like to me, that was just part of the job. So I never took a fee when I was employed by Google or Yahoo or Netscape. So it's really only been in the last 5 years since I've been sort of independent that that I've been doing that. And it's not, I mean, more often, I mean, it depends on the conference. You know, there are some conferences where I feel like, okay, this is a huge tech conference in Asia or in Europe, and it's reaching 20,000 people, and there are other CEOs and people like that who are speaking, and you know, I'm not going to ask for a speaker's fee because they're not paying their speakers. But you know, there may be other conferences where it's like, you know, agile conference in Australia or whatever, you know, where it's not necessarily something that really fits in with something I would normally do. And so that's where it would really have to be, you know, they would have to make it worth my while, because I would normally just say no.
And I want to add to that, kind of speak to like the scale of compensation. I have, all of my experience would be speaking at kind of design focused conferences, and speaking both for, you know, free, so no cost covered, up to, you know, travel and honorarium, etc. And now my kind of minimum is having those travel costs covered. Although my company would pay for my travel costs. But the reason that I think it's important to ask specifically for travel costs to be covered is kind of a diversity and inclusion issue, specifically how we might exclude folks who don't work for those kinds of companies, and they would not be enabled to join these kinds of conferences or speak at these kinds of conferences. And I want both conference organizers and participants to kind of be conscious about what kind of voices that we are raising up and that we are putting on stage and we're enabling to share their stories. And I think by asking for, you know, a minimum of travel costs to be covered, it enables a wider range of folks to kind of take those opportunities. And you know, in terms of pricing and tickets, the kind of design conferences that I've spoken at least, you know, they do make money. They're not, you know, they're not run by nonprofits. And if folks are willing to pay, you know, per ticket, maybe an extra $50, an extra $75 on top of that regular ticket price, that enables a wider range of voices to participate in this. So then that's what I would add to what Irene and Donna have mentioned.
Cool. Awesome. That's great. Thank you. And I want to remind everyone, we have a couple minutes left. If you have questions, you can add them in the Q&A. Awesome. Someone just asked, I don't see design conferences with CFPs. So that's call for proposals. For those of you who are new to the term, is that a normal? Where do you look for CFPs, and how do you get to a place where they look for you? So when does that transition from applying to conferences versus being asked to speak? And then when you do apply, where do you find them?
So there are some really great lists being shared around. For example, Women Talk Design will share calls for proposal, and in a bunch of Slack groups, they'll also share which ones are going around. So for example, the Design Ops Summit that I spoke at has a call for proposal. They also run Enterprise UX, which has a call for proposal. And both speaking at and part of the advisory committee for the Joint Futures Conference in Finland, and we also have a call for proposal. And I think kind of transitioning from the call for proposal to being invited is kind of demonstrating that you are a storyteller and that you have kind of thought through points to communicate or kind of case studies that you might share. And that might be like a podcast or even something, you know, simpler and smaller, like a Medium post that shows organizers that you have both the ability to communicate something engaging and interesting and kind of the moment. Something that Lou Rosenfeld actually told me that's really been a great piece of advice that I have moving forward is that conferences are curated conversations. And so whether they're having a call for proposal or they're actively going to seek speakers, they're looking for voices and stories that might add to that curated set of conversations. And so if you can demonstrate either in your own body of work or through, you know, submitting that you can add to that, that's a really strong point.
Awesome. Thanks, Hannah. Donna or Irene, anything to add?
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, no. Okay. I hate writing proposals. I am terrible at writing proposals. Early on, when I first was submitting to conference, I would write proposals, and I got into a few, and I think I was really, I'll call it luck, because I often met the person who accepted the proposal, and they usually told me, oh, the topic sounded so cool, and that's why they accepted me. But I've had things like a keynote that I delivered for years that was turned into a book that was really successful, that people said would like change the way they worked, and it was like the best keynote they ever saw. That I had submitted several times to different conferences, never got in with that thing. So getting proposals accepted just means you're a good proposal writer. It doesn't mean that your stuff is any good. So one thing I found over the years, once I got past the whole submitting proposals, and again, this took a few years, but eventually I started just directly reaching out to conferences and doing this really methodically. It became part of my job, and actually a big revenue stream for me as well, because I work for myself. So I'd have a spreadsheet, conferences that I was interested in, I would just contact them. And I would say, hi, I have a topic I think your audience would love. Can I teach a workshop? Can I give a talk? And eventually, can I keynote your conference? And eventually became 50-50. And once I did that enough, I got enough exposure, I started getting asked to do the same. But yeah, I felt confident and I just asked. And I'm not really good at asking for things. But so, you know, I think proposals are a great way to start early on. But when I tell people that I often ask to speak at conferences, they're shocked. Like people, seasoned speakers who have been doing this for years are shocked that like you could just ask. So I just want to put that out there. If people are not great proposal writers, there is hope. There is another way. But you'll get a lot of non-responses too, and that's okay.
Awesome. Irene, were you?
I mean, like I said, I've always been a reluctant speaker, so I've never submitted a proposal. There have been people who have submitted proposals on my behalf. So like if they wanted to organize a panel at South by Southwest or something and they wanted to pull me along, then I would, you know, they would submit the proposal and I would say, yeah, if you get it accepted, I'll speak with you. And a couple of times that has happened. I do find that there's sort of a virtuous cycle. So like after one or two talks get posted online, if they kind of go, not like go viral or whatever, but if enough people see them and appreciate them, then I'll get invitations to speak more. The other thing I do is I post the transcript, like I post the narratives online, like they're all findable on Medium. And so, and I used to feel like every time I spoke, I would need to have like a new talk every single time. And my husband's like, no, you don't need to do that. People recycle talks all the time. And it's true. It's like, so I've come to recognize that just because one audience sees a talk doesn't necessarily mean that they've read it online, doesn't mean that other people have seen this talk either. And so the ones that I'm really, that resonate with people, I've come to accept that it's okay for me to give the same talk more than once. But for me, you know, like speaking at conferences has never been the focal point of my work. I'm just much more focused on doing the job that I have. and pouring myself into that. And speaking at conferences publicly about the work is just sort of a byproduct of having done the work. So that's always how I've approached it.
Awesome. Great. I'm going to have one last quick, would love your quick answer on this before we go. We are at time. I know that there are so many more questions we can ask these amazing women. And I just want to say thank you so much for your time and sharing your experience and your expertise and your advice. Thank you for everyone who called in too. We are going to send out a feedback survey. We'd love to hear from you afterwards. But just before we sign off really quickly, I wanted to just ask for a one sentence best piece of advice that you want to share with people who are interested in getting started with speaking. So it could be a piece of advice that you were given or just something that you've learned along the way. Donna, do you want to start?
No, someone else start. That's a tough question. I'm thinking about it. No.
Hannah?
I think that I already shared it, but I think Lou Rosenfeld's comment is the one that really resonated with me the most. If you're nervous to get on stage, if you have imposter syndrome, which is something a lot of us struggle with, just remember you're not expected to be the expert. You're not there to have the final answer on something. You are there to share your story that only you can tell and to add to a set of conversations.
Awesome. Thanks, Hannah. Irene?
In a word, it would just be breathe. Just, connect with the breath before going on stage, during the talk, and I think that's so centering and calming. Of course, speaking as a yoga teacher, that's definitely going to be the foundation, but I have found that has been enormously helpful.
Awesome. Thank you. Donna?
I'll add to that, that the audience wants you to succeed. Everyone's rooting for you. I've never encountered an instance where that's not the case. And so just know that, you're, and if it helps, trick yourself. You're helping your community, you're teaching, you're sharing, and everyone's rooting for you. And it's not about being perfect or awesome or anything like that. It's just, sharing and giving.
Awesome. Great. Well, thank you all again so much. We have some thank yous coming in through the chat too. And have a wonderful rest of your day. And thanks for joining.
Thank you, Danielle.
Yeah.
Bye.